creates a new array, this time with a very current picture of Neil Miller. And guess what? The victim picks a new picture as well. The average person, I submit, would not even think they were the same person. That's how much Neil Miller had changed in the intervening years.
In fact, at the trial, the detective concedes that Miller's features had changed dramatically.
And so it raises some very serious questions about why the detective didn't take a contemporary photograph of Neil Miller in the first place.
Miller hoped that this discrepancy would come to light at trial.
We just figured when he got to court, they would figure it out that it wasn't him, and that would be the end of it.
But things don't play out that way.
The day I was sitting, the day that we were, the day that I was, February 26, 1990.
The day of Neil's pretrial hearing. A day that would haunt him for years to come.
Because that was the day when I got to see the victim.
Neil's lawyer had requested that his client be kept apart from the victim.
If the witness sees only one young black man sitting next to the lawyer, it doesn't take great skills to know which one's the perp. But the district attorney's office ignored that request and actually instructed the police officer to take the victim downstairs, and if she saw the man who did this to her, to make an identification to the officer.
That's when the victim came and stood right in front of me. The officer that was standing there with her, while he was standing there, he kept saying 3 times, "That's Neil Miller. Is he the one?" I look at them. She's hand over her mouth, shrugging her shoulders. "But that's Neil Miller. Is he the one?" And she said that yes, he's the one.
It's just outrageous. Particularly when a lawyer goes on the record saying, I don't want this kind of identification to occur because it's going to poison any future identification at trial.
I ran inside the courtroom and asked them where was my lawyer, and watched enough television to know that can't do this.
It was done unconstitutionally, and so the district attorney's office later on agreed the victim would be precluded from saying yes, and I saw him on another occasion. But the problem is that kind of remedy is meaningless because the damage has been done. You can't unring the bell.
If proper eyewitness procedures had been done and a mistake had been prevented, Neil Miller wouldn't be in jail.
But Neil Miller's fate has already been sealed. He'll be spending the next several decades behind bars.
We were scared for him, to be going to prison with those charges, and he didn't do it.
It got to the point where there's nothing else he can do.
I felt that, I was never going to get out.
Neil's nightmarish prison life soon goes from bad to worse.
Next thing I know, here they come cuffing me up.
Miller finds himself in the cruel isolation of psychiatric lockdown. When we return.
I am not absent by choice, but by force. I ask not to become a prisoner of my own sanity, but I crave for language of intimate and controversial conversation.
After several years in prison for a rape he claims he didn't commit, Neil Miller finds his own form of escape.
All I know is at that time I just wanted to write.
That's how he was releasing himself through his poems.
That was my peace of mind.
But in this prison, peace of mind is hard to come by.
He got in a few incidents with some of the guards up there.
Everyone around there wanted to kill me.
As a convicted rapist, he is at the bottom of the inmate hierarchy.
Oh, I was the lowest on the food chain. You're a rapist and they don't like you. Murderers are revered much more than rapists are.
People who are convicted of rape are treated far worse by other inmates and by guards than are people who are in for other crimes.
Driven to free himself, Neil gets a court-appointed attorney, Nona Walker, and finds some hope.
He told me that he hadn't done this crime.
I was telling her everything that I found wrong with the case.
Of course, a lot of my clients tell me that they are innocent, but there was something about the intensity with which he talked.
She was like, I believe you. I believe you didn't do this.
Nona Walker gets to work arguing Neil's appeal. She challenges the identification the victim made at the pretrial hearing.
My theory was that any subsequent identifications would be tainted because the victim was reinforcing her notion that this was the person. I thought that particularly the identification issue was at least a respectable issue that should get a fair look from the appeals court.
But the court does not agree, and in 1993, Miller's appeal is denied.
The crime took place during daylight hours, and the victim and the perpetrator were in each other's presence for at least an hour. So in that type of instance, you have a situation where a victim, jury's mind, should very easily be able to identify the perpetrator.
I did not think that the court gave us a fair shake.
We both prayed that it was just a minor setback, that, there might be some other way for me to get back into court.
But there's a huge obstacle in Miller's way.
An inmate convicted of rape had to go through the sexual offender group therapy program in prison before he would be eligible for parole.
They told me that I would have a very good chance of getting out if I admit to the crime and if I go through the rape treatment program.
Only problem is, he wasn't a rapist.
I told them I'm not gonna go through that. They would have took that as an admittance of guilt. And I didn't have no guilt because I didn't rape the woman.
When someone goes to the extremes to prove their innocence, you pretty much know they're telling you the truth.
That was just another piece that convinced me that he was probably innocent.
But it does not convince the state of Massachusetts. And Neil's refusal of treatment poses a new threat.
Because he won't admit that he's a rapist.
In Massachusetts, it means you are committed to the treatment center for the sexually dangerous, and it means that you are likely to be there for a very long time, if not for the rest of your life.
And so Neil was given an evaluation by psychiatrists.
It's his one chance to prove that he's not a predator.
I told the lady a story.
It's a proverb about a young boy.
He hung himself in the name of injustice. It was just something that I felt associated with me. And I'm talking to her, thinking the interview's going great, and the next thing I know, she tells me I can leave.
But as Neil turns to go, he is taken aback.
I hear a bunch of footsteps just coming, like racing up the stairs. There was like 6 to 7 officers. They were like, turn around and cuff up. I was like, for what?
Unbeknownst to Neil, he is headed to psychiatric lockdown.
And they're like, strip. I'm like, for what? They're like, strip, take your clothes off, or we'll take them off you.
Neil has no choice but to comply.
They tossed me a paper robe, and they like, just left me in there without no explanation whatsoever.
These psychiatrists concluded that Neil Miller has no insight into his problem.
Not only did Miller refuse to admit to rape, they believe he is suicidal.
They heard the story and they just automatically assumed that I was contemplating suicide.
After a week and a half in isolation, Neil is sent back to the sex offenders program.
And I told them, I'm not going to go.
This time, the parole officer's response resonates with Neil.
She was like, well, if you feel that you were so innocent, why don't you go down to the law library and get yourself out of here? I said, you're absolutely right, and that's exactly what I'm gonna do.
Neil starts researching and learns about DNA analysis.
called up the one friend I had, Nona Walker, and I asked her, I was like, how can I go about getting DNA testing?
There was no provision in Massachusetts law for the state to pay for post-conviction DNA testing. So I started looking for other ways to try to have it done.
And that's when Nona Walker told me about it.
The Innocence Project, a team of lawyers and law students dedicated to using DNA evidence to free the wrongfully imprisoned.
I was told that Neil should write to them and then they would send him some paperwork that he could fill out and send back to them.
It was all he talked about, that, you know, he wanted to get all the information. He was writing his letters, and that was his focus.
And the last question on there was like, how can DNA evidence help you? And I was like, because I didn't do it. That's it, because I didn't do it. And there's no way it should come back saying I did it.
But the Innocence Project gets thousands of letters a week. Why would they take on Neil Miller?
A good eyewitness can trump all other evidence in the case.
But if you just actually listen to the case from the beginning, it just had a lot of questions and there was no answer.
The Innocence Project sees a huge weakness in the prosecution's case.
Eyewitness misidentification is the single greatest cause of wrongful conviction.
And that if it's a cross-racial identification, the likelihood of a misidentification is that much greater.
The project agrees to help Miller.
That's when everything to me was like, okay, it's looking a little better.
They begin by tackling the evidence that convicted him almost a decade before.
There are two pieces of evidence in this case. There's a victim who is absolutely certain this is the man who raped her. And secondly, that identification is corroborated by physical evidence.
Evidence that came from ABO blood typing, the conventional serology used before the advent of DNA science. Evidence indicating Neil's blood type matches the swabs collected from the victim.
When they tested the vaginal swab in this case, all they found was a blood type consistent with somebody who's an O type. The victim is type O. The defendant also happens to be type O.
At the time, the ABO testing was cutting edge, but it couldn't identify anybody. It would give you percentages.
So in this case, at best, what you might say is, well, 45% of the population is type O.
Sure, he was one of the people that could have done it, but so were probably a couple of people in the jury box.
Would be helpful to.
But the Innocence Project points out an even bigger problem with how the biological evidence was interpreted.
The problem is that you don't know what percentage of these secretions are attributable to the vaginal secretions and what percentage are semen.
It's possible all they're reading is the victim, and they didn't get anything from the suspect.
So serologists developed a bright line rule. And the bright line rule is that unless you see an ABO marker that is foreign to the victim, that can't be attributed to the victim, you can never draw any inference at all about what ABO type the male semen donor is.
You could make very little comparisons or jump to almost no conclusion.
Nonetheless, at trial, the state's expert identified the rapist as having Neil's blood type.
And so when this serologist, who knew better, went into court and said, we kind of know that the perpetrator would be a type O, he was misstating the science.
And there's something else that puzzles the Innocence Project.
What about the sheet?
The bed sheet on which the victim had been raped.
The stained bedsheet that the detective took from the crime scene was not used against Neil at trial.
She collects that sheet properly and sends it off to the crime laboratory. So she